The floor of the Tata steel plant vibrated with a low, constant hum that rattled the teeth. Ratan Tata stood near the main furnace, his boots thick with industrial dust, watching the molten iron pour into the molds. The heat was a physical weight, pressing against his skin, but he did not step back. He moved toward a group of laborers, struggling with a jammed hydraulic press. He did not issue orders from a distance. He stepped into the workspace, knelt beside the machine, and pointed to a misaligned bolt that had stalled the entire line. The workers paused, then followed his lead, wrenching the metal into place until the gears groaned and caught again. He stood up, wiping grease from his palms onto a rag, his eyes tracking the flow of the cooling steel. He spent his hours here, not in a quiet office, but in the center of the noise and the grit. He learned the resistance of every bolt and the precise temperature required to temper the metal. This was his classroom. He watched the rhythm of the work, noting the fatigue in the men around him. When the shift whistle finally blew, he remained, staring into the cooling embers. The transition from the factory floor to the chairman's office was not a retreat, but a scaling of his perspective. Ratan spread the organizational chart across his desk, tracing the lines that connected the disparate branches of the conglomerate. He saw a fragmented map. Some sectors were thriving, while others were stagnant, isolated from one another. He picked up a red pen and began to draw new connections, envisioning a singular, global entity that could compete on a world stage. His first target was clear: Tetley Tea. When he proposed the acquisition, the boardroom filled with hushed whispers and sharp intakes of breath. Skeptics leaned forward, questioning the logic of such a massive expansion. He let the silence stretch, then pushed the documents across the mahogany surface. He did not argue or raise his voice. He simply waited for the pen to move. When the final signature was placed, the map on his desk changed irrevocably. He watched the board members leave, their faces still clouded with uncertainty, but he did not look back. He had already begun drafting the next set of lines. The success of the tea acquisition was merely a prelude. Ratan turned his attention to the heavy industry that had formed his foundation, steel. He set his sights on Chorus, a European giant, envisioning a merger that would redefine the global market. The announcement triggered an immediate, violent reaction from the financial world. Headlines across the morning papers screamed of overreach and reckless ambition. Analysts filled the airwaves with dire warnings, predicting that the deadlock would crush the conglomerate. Ratan sat in his office, the stack of critical reports growing taller. He did not call for a press release to defend his choice. He did not reach for the phone to silence the critics. Instead, he spent his nights reviewing the integration plans. He walked the halls of the office, his pace steady, his gaze fixed on the blueprints rather than the stock tickers. The board members watched him, waiting for a sign of hesitation, but he remained anchored in his conviction. He knew the risks were immense. He picked up his pen, ignored the mounting chorus of doubt, and finalized the bid. He closed the file, the silence in the room heavy. The steel merger was still settling when Ratan turned his gaze toward the automotive world. He saw the potential for a transformation that would place the company at the forefront of global luxury and engineering. He initiated contact with Ford, setting his sights on the acquisition of Jaguar Land Rover. The reaction from the global automotive community was immediate and biting. Industry experts and analysts openly questioned his sanity. They pointed to the decline of the brands, the complexity of the supply chains, and the sheer scale of the investment required. The air in the boardroom at Bombay House grew thin with the pressure of their skepticism. Every phone call from Detroit felt like a test of his resolve. Ratan spent his days in meetings, listening to the chorus of doubt that echoed from financial capitals across the globe. He watched the stock prices fluctuate, a visual representation of the world's lack of faith in his vision. He knew that one wrong move would not just impact the balance sheet, but could potentially dismantle the reputation he had spent years building. He sat at the head of the table, his hands resting flat on the surface, absorbing the tension without flinching. The negotiations were not merely about assets. The ink was barely dry on the contracts when Ratan boarded a flight to the United Kingdom. He arrived at the Jaguar plant to find the atmosphere heavy with dread. The workers stood in clusters near the assembly lines, their eyes fixed on the floor, waiting for the inevitable news of restructuring and job cuts. The silence in the facility was absolute, broken only by the hum of idle machinery. Ratan walked onto the floor, bypassing the executive offices entirely. He stopped at the first station, reached out, and shook the hand of a worker whose grip was tight with anxiety. He did not speak in abstract terms of corporate strategy. He looked them in the eye and stated clearly that their roles were secure. He moved from station to station, repeating the promise, his voice steady against the backdrop of the massive factory. The tension that had gripped the room began to dissipate, replaced by a visible release of breath. He spent hours on the floor, listening to their concerns. By the time he left the building, the fear that had defined the morning had vanished. He had secured the commitment of the people who kept it alive. Back in India, the scale of his ambition shifted from global luxury to the realities of the street. Ratan stood on the roadside, watching a family of 4 huddle together on a single motorcycle. The rain slicked the asphalt, and the child clung to the driver, shivering against the downpour. He watched them weave through traffic, exposed and vulnerable. That night, he sat at his desk and sketched the silhouette of a small, accessible vehicle on a notepad. He envisioned a car that would provide safety and dignity to the common man. The project moved rapidly to the plains of Singu, where the foundation for a massive production facility was laid. But the dream hit a wall. Local protests erupted, blocking the gates and halting the flow of materials. The site became a flashpoint of conflict. Ratan received reports of barricades and shouting crowds that refused to yield. The construction equipment sat idle, rusting in the humidity. Analysts declared the project dead, claiming the land disputes were insurmountable. The pressure mounted as deadlines slipped, and investors demanded a retreat. Ratan stood in his office, made a single, decisive call, and initiated the relocation of the entire production line to Gujarat. The fight for the Nano had moved to a desperate race. The relocation to Gujarat was a logistical marathon. Ratan arrived at the new site while the concrete was still setting. He spent the following weeks on the floor, coordinating the arrival of machinery and the calibration of the assembly robots. The air in the facility was thick with the scent of welding and oil. He worked through the night, his presence a constant among the engineers. They operated under a relentless clock, piecing together the production line that had been torn from the earth in Singur. Then came the final test. The power hummed, the conveyor belt lurched into motion, and the first frame began its journey. The tension in the room was palpable. When the vehicle cleared the end of the line, the silence was broken by the cheers of the workers. Ratan walked to the vehicle, opened the door, and settled into the driver's seat. He gripped the steering wheel, feeling the weight. A small, quiet smile touched his face. The promise he had made on a rain-slicked road was now a tangible reality. The global financial markets plummeted, and the ripples reached the heart of the conglomerate. Across the industry, competitors reacted with immediate, sweeping layoffs. Thousands of workers were dismissed as companies slashed expenses to survive the downturn. In the boardroom, the atmosphere was heavy with the language of survival. Analysts and advisors presented spreadsheets filled with red ink, urging Ratan to cut the workforce to protect the bottom line. They argued that the fiscal reality left no other choice. Ratan listened to the proposals, his gaze fixed on the reports, then pushed the documents aside. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the courtyard where the employees were moving between buildings. He turned back to the board and delivered his verdict. He would not sacrifice the people who had built the company to satisfy the short-term demands of the market. He insisted that the strength of the organization resided in its human capital, not in the margins of a ledger. The decision sent shockwaves through the financial community. Critics labeled it a reckless gamble, but Ratan held his ground. He navigated the volatility by prioritizing the welfare of his staff, ensuring that when the markets eventually stabilized, the company remained intact. The halls of Bombay House were quiet, the frantic energy of the boardroom replaced by the steady hum of a legacy in motion. Ratan walked slowly, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors. He passed the archives where the records of his first acquisitions were stored. The ink on those early contracts, now part of a much larger story. He stopped before a wall map, his eyes tracing the lines he had drawn years ago. What had once been a fragmented collection of local interests was now a singular, global entity, pulsing with activity across continents. He touched the wood of a heavy table, feeling the grain beneath his fingertips, a reminder of the shop floor where he had started. He had spent his life building, not for the sake of the ledger, but for the people who relied on the strength of the institution. He observed the bustling activity through the windows, seeing the results of his choices in the movement of the city below. He had navigated the storms of global crises and the pressures of technological shifts, leaving behind a clear blueprint for ethical leadership. It was a structure built on the belief that profit was only a byproduct of a greater purpose. As he moved toward the exit, he did not look back. He left behind a foundation that would support generations. The doors opened to the street, and he stepped out, leaving the legacy to stand on its own.